If we hold back on our anger, it's like we put this dam in the river that we're trying to let flow. And any dam in there is going to affect the way it flows. It'll just come spilling out in some other way, in some other juncture, if you will, in the river. Whereas if we allow it, if we recognize this host of uncomfortable feelings is going to be part of my grieving process, including some feelings I don't actually want to feel about the person or around the person that I've lost. And just normalizing that, understanding that that's part of the process, I think that can make it a lot smoother for folks here. Hey, Selysa.
Hey, Nathan. Welcome back.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we're having another chance to talk today.
Yeah. So today we are addressing complicated circumstances leading up to the death of the loved one. And we might even get into a little bit of complicated circumstances after the death, because sometimes in the wake of a death, you find out things that you didn't know about, and that can be a lot to process.
Yeah, yes. I definitely came up with some of that in my own grieving process. And let's also just note here for everyone that we'll get into as much as we get into. We'll talk about some of the different kinds of complicated circumstances that we have experience with and that we know about. There may be some that we don't touch on, and there may be other episodes in the future where we kind of circle back to this issue when we're talking about a different complicating circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So where should we start?
I think we should start with emotional validation. That if something happened, like you were in a fight or you were not on speaking terms, and then the person happened to pass, there might be a temptation to be extremely angry at the person, but to feel that you're not allowed to be angry because they're dead now. Or vice versa, there might be a lot of sadness that they're dead, but you might feel like you should be really angry because you've been really angry at them for the past several days or months or years of their life.
Yeah.
And to just name that there's no right or wrong number or quantity or category of emotions to be having in this circumstance.
Yeah.
That it's just important to feel it all and to not let society put shoulds on you.
Yeah, yes. There's so many places where society is trying to do that, and grieving is no less of that kind of terrain for sure.
Yeah.
Where there's all kinds of, oh, you got to tidy this up pretty quick, or get back to normal, or move on, or all the things that often push to do in our grieving processes. Mm-hmm. This can be one of them too, where it's like, you shouldn't be mad at them. They've passed, Mm-hmm. And like you're saying, those feelings are often there, whether we had a complicated circumstance with the person who passed or not. Feelings like anger, resentment. We've also talked about regret and guilt, all kinds of uncomfortable feelings that seem like they have nothing to do with grieving the loss are likely to jump in there too. And making room for them is so important to the process, right? Otherwise like, for instance, if we hold back on our anger, it's like we put this dam in the river that we're trying to let flow. And any dam in there is going to affect the way it flows. It'll just come spilling out in some other way, in some other juncture, if you will, in the river. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we allow it, if we recognize this host of uncomfortable feelings is going to be part of my grieving process, including some feelings I don't actually want to feel about the person or around the person that I've lost. And just normalizing that, understanding that that's part of the process, I think that can make it a lot smoother for folks here.
This kind of reminds me of the 5 stages of grief. And we have a whole episode where we debunk the 5 stages of grief. But I think a blessing of the 5 stages of grief, which we don't subscribe to, are that it lists out emotions and validates them.
Yeah.
One of the stages of grief is anger. You're going to be angry at the person. Another one is regret. Another one is guilt. And in that episode, we went into how it's not enough emotions, that there's so many more. Mm-hmm. But what I do appreciate about the cultural script of the 5 stages of grief is that it does validate the anger and the guilt and the regret. So if you're going to take anything from the 5 stages of grief, let it be emotional validation.
Yeah. Of at least, 4 or 5 of the feelings that will come up in the whole range.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that concept, that there are feelings that will come up and we should understand that they're going to come up and do our best to allow them to come up, even though Some of them might seem antithetical to the love and the missing and the yearning that we're also doing.
So what happens when someone denies themselves that process?
Oh boy, yeah, that could use a whole episode. Well, just to tap on it a little bit at this moment, if we're not expressing feelings, whatever they are, especially uncomfortable feelings, we're trying to tamp them down or we're not allowing ourselves to have those, then, sometimes I think the general thinking is if I don't allow the anger, then the anger will just go away and I won't have to have it. But what we see over and over in the research is actually that the anger doesn't go away. It stays. And without going too far into all of the ins and outs of it, I think that there's a kind of intelligence in the human system that recognizes that we have feelings like that haven't been expressed and need to be expressed. So we then kind of drive ourselves to opportunities for that feeling to come up. So I see this with my clients all the time. I've definitely seen it in my research over the last 20 years that people who try to suppress a feeling like anger run into more situations where they're like, oh, I feel so much irritation and frustration around this. They're not letting themselves feel anger, but it's just like more and more and more places where that kind of a situation comes up for them. Two other things I think that happens if we're suppressing feelings rather than allowing them, even if they're uncomfortable. When we hold back a feeling and try not to let it out, it's still going to look for a way out. Our system is still trying to get us to release this kind of like splinter that we have in our system, So it's going to come out in places where we would rather it not. We're going to have a bigger reaction to something our partner says, or bigger reaction to something our child says, or bigger reaction to something that happens or a thought that we have than we would otherwise. And in those moments, we're likely to be less tidy in our emotional expression, or less kind in our emotional expression, or less, even self-supportive in our emotional expression, and say things or do things with others or even to ourselves that we don't mean to or don't want to. So that's another kind of problematic thing that can show up. The other thing is, and there's really interesting research touching on this, is that if we live a life holding back feelings that we need to be expressing, then there's really strong evidence that we see more in chronic inflammation, pain, and illness. And I think of those as other ways that our body is then trying to get the feeling out of us. Mm-hmm. And we don't need that on top of our grieving process.
Certainly not. That reminds me of the phrase that hurt people.
Yeah. Yes.
And so the hurt person is the person who hasn't validated and expressed their emotions around the grief in this instance. Mm-hmm. And then they go on to hurt other people with it. And I believe that that's why anyone hurts anyone in this world at all.
Yeah.
Is because they were hurt, they didn't know how to process it, and then they pass on that pain.
Yeah.
So a huge part of my work in the world is disrupting that cycle.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah. And in this instance, that looks like feeling your feelings about the complicated circumstances despite society's shooting on you.
Yeah. Yeah. Wherever you go, but in this case in particular, we're talking about feelings like resentment or anger or even like fear that hangs out after we've lost someone, or even longing for, for it to have been one way or another before they passed and not getting to that place of healing or reconnection, all kinds of uncomfortable feelings that seem like they shouldn't be part of the grieving process, or like I said, antithetical to the grieving process. Giving ourselves room to just let those out. And even though it's kind of ugly, even though we don't want our loved one to like hear us being mad at them, so to speak, recognizing that wherever they are, they're not going to be hurt by our feelings, no matter what your cosmology is. And then also as a way to continue your own healing, your own processing through the grief, not putting this dam in the river, so to speak. Mm-hmm. You have some experience with this. Is there anything that you want to share from your own, did you try to hold back some of these feelings of anger, or did it get in the way of your own, or was it anger? Did it get in the way of your grieving?
I think that in my first major grief, which was the grief of my mother when I was 21 years old, I was just so confused and run thin and pretty lifeless in some moments. And I think it's because I had no framework for how to process losing someone who loved me very much and hurt me a lot. And then my next big complicated grief was someone very dear to me passing away to suicide about 3 years ago now. And when that happened, I literally said out loud many times, grief mode turning on.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had the framework of how to deal with it that I had to learn the extremely hard way, mostly on my own from my mother's passing. And I had gained so many tools since then around emotional processing and nervous system regulating and awareness of self that I had to fall back on. It certainly didn't become the disabling, I need to quit everything and run away to India to have space because India is cheap and has healing modalities. I can stay there indefinitely. So I was able to continue functioning in life after that extremely complicated grief because I had the tools of emotional processing and regulating to fall back on.
Mm-hmm. So I definitely hear in that some of what we're already sharing with folks, which is, allow these feelings, make room for these feelings. And through some of the other things that we've shared in other episodes and will continue to share, engaging with them in ways that are useful so that you can process through them, regulate through them instead of suppressing them or holding them back or having them overwhelm you even.
Yeah. And I also want to name that when grieving someone, especially complicated grief, you are still grieving your entire relationship with them, not just the moments leading up to the death or the days or weeks or years or however long it got complicated for leading up to the death. So, for example, a mother of someone who passes to suicide might have the whole babyhood and childhood and adolescence and young adulthood of their child to grieve, not just this anger and chaos that led up to the mental unwellness leading to the event.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that needs to be grieved. And by grieved, it's like working through emotions and working through memories. It's working through, wow, that memory was so amazing. And now it's almost as though the memory is tainted with sadness. But there can still be joy there once the sadness of the memory is worked through.
Yeah. Yes. I love the way that you're talking about that in terms of like the picture I'm getting is giving ourselves room to go back through some of the things that just naturally come up, but then also investigating some of our specific stories that we have around this person that we've lost, and then the feelings that come up around those specific stories as a way to begin to unravel some of this complication, if you will. Yeah, I think that's so important. And as a natural kind of way of like sifting through the what's there, the material that's there, and seeing what comes up for us around it, seeing what we need to work through around it, and allowing that process to just kind of happen for a time. Like, I think of it as almost like mentally and emotionally going through the boxes that the person may have left behind.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these are our boxes of stuff we have still with the person, even though they've passed.
Yeah. This episode is brought to you by the Center for Emotional Education and Sacramento Reiki Center, where we support full-time grievers every day. Many of our clients have tried everything and it still hasn't been enough. After our work together, they gain the tools and skills that they need to navigate their grief on their own. You can get more information at sacramentoreikicenter.com and centerforoemotionaleducation.com.
You started to tap on there too, or just touch on an example, and I think it was a really, really great example of a mother grieving a child who passed via suicide, and the kind of complicated path that mother would be traveling through on their grieving journey. It makes me wonder about other circumstances or other scenarios that you can think of that are in this arena. Like you also mentioned, like someone who loved us very much, but maybe hurt us.
An abusive parent or an abusive sibling or an abusive spouse. Anyone that abused you.
Yeah.
There in abusive relationships, there can be a lot of love and attachment. And there is also hurt.
Yeah. Right. So I think that's actually an interesting, almost like decoder ring. Like, was the relationship complicated? Because then the grief is probably going to be complicated too.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. But so those examples where you were with someone who was hurting you as well as loving you, situation like that where there's like a lot of confusion or not understanding the motivation around, especially if it was a suicide.
Mhm. Also, just getting in a fight with someone and
Ooh,
then passing away to untimely circumstances.
yes. Which can be complicated on both parts. Like maybe there's still something hanging over from what they did right before they passed, but there might also be the grief and regret or guilt and regret that
Hmm.
comes up on your side of how
Hmm.
that interaction went.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's so important. I think too, even you touched on this, like when we find out after the person has passed that our relationship with them was maybe more complicated or there was something going on that we didn't know about.
Yeah, so you can also discover things about the person you're grieving after they're gone, which is a whole trip because you don't get to process that with them.
Right, right.
Yeah. So there's the example of a widow finding out that their spouse was cheating on them several months or years after they're already dead.
Mm-hmm.
I've certainly witnessed that, and that is a trip because you have all of these memories of this beautiful life together, and then you have to go through and reprocess your memories and realize that there was more going on that you didn't know about.
Yeah, yes. Similarly, but not involving infidelity per se, finding out about the person that you've lost, like just finding out other things about the circumstances that they were living in before they passed,
Mm-hmm.
maybe illnesses that they had that they didn't talk about, or
Mm-hmm.
conditions of their home that they didn't talk about,
Mm-hmm.
or even, conditions of their relationship with others that they didn't talk about. Those things can be, factors that we find out after the fact that can also really complicate our relationship to the grieving that we're doing. As we're talking about this more, I'm wanting to disambiguate just a little bit because we're talking about complicated circumstances around the grieving and how that can make the grieving more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to make sure that we're pointing out that that's different from what is called complicated grief disorder or syndrome, sometimes also called prolonged grief disorder or syndrome, which is it can happen in this kind of a scenario where there's circumstances that invite a more complicated processing. Complicated grief can also show up just when the relationship with the person is of such import or meaning to the person who's grieving that it just takes longer and there's more to sift through and their process is prolonged, if you will. And
Yeah.
I want to put air quotes around prolonged because our society says anything past the funeral is too long. So, and I'm
Actually, in the DSM, it says anything past 6 months is too long. So actually,
right.
medically, you're allowed 6 months,
Exactly.
not
That's what I was
there.
about to say. Like 6 months, I don't know if that's long enough to then after that it's complicated or it's prolonged.
Yeah.
I think some of that has to do with the way in which we now relate to grieving and grief and other emotions has us have a little bit less or a lot less tolerance for the length of time it can sometimes take,
Yeah.
such that we're maybe in some cases, definitely pathologizing really normal grief.
Yeah, let's not pathologize normal grief.
Let's not do that.
Let's not do that. I want to share the Suicide Survivors Bill of Rights. And I found this in my grieving journey, and it was incredibly helpful for me. I think at one point I made it my phone screensaver because I just needed the constant reminder.
So good.
And I tried to find out who it originated from, and I found like 7 different people cited as the author of it on like 7 different websites. So I have no idea where it came from. And a lot of people are taking credit for it. So if anyone knows who actually is the founder of this, please tell us, because I would really love to know. And I'm just going to go through this. It's the Survivor of Suicide Loss Bill of Rights. Number 1, I have the right to be free of guilt. Number 2, I have the right not to feel responsible for the death by suicide. Number 3, I have the right to express my feelings and emotions, even if they do not seem acceptable, as long as they do not interfere with the rights of others. And I want to name that this is applicable to many complicated circumstances of death, because a lot of people feel responsible for their loved one's death, even if they weren't there or yada yada. And I ultimately had to come to the conclusion that as long as I did not murder someone or bully them, I am not responsible. So if you are not a murderer and you are not a bully, then there's no guilt needed. But the guilt's there.
Yeah.
And it deserves emotion and it deserves the emotional processing space-time, but it's a feeling, not a fact.
Yeah, I definitely want to tack on to that really quick, because I think you have the right to be free of guilt, but that doesn't give you the right to ignore guilt that's coming up for you.
Yes. Absolutely.
Do express it.
Yeah. Number 4, I have the right to have my questions answered honestly by authorities and family members if possible. 5, I have the right to not be deceived because others believe they can spare me further grief. And that kind of goes into the finding out things about the person post-death, that you have the right to the full truth. 6, I have the right to maintain a sense of hopefulness. 7, I have the right to peace and dignity. 8, I have the right to positive feelings about one I lost through suicide, regardless of events prior to or at the time of the untimely death. 9, I have the right to retain my individuality and not be judged because of this loss through suicide. 10, I have the right to seek counseling and support groups to enable me to further explore my feelings honestly, to further the acceptance process. I really like that one. 11, I have the right to reach acceptance about this loss and the complex factors leading up to it. 12, I have the right to a new beginning. I have the right to be.
It's beautiful.
And I think that list can really support people and give them hope when they're in what I would call the depths of despair. Because often the depths of despair feel so hopeless.
Yeah. Yes. I appreciate you bringing it up here and sharing it with folks, because, of course, losing someone to suicide is a complicating factor. It's definitely going to invite some complication in what comes up for us as we're grieving that person. But it's also so applicable to any of the rest of us, no matter how we lost our loved one, if there is some complication in the relationship or in the circumstances. Any one of these and all of these that you just read could be really useful for us.
Yeah.
I also appreciate what I intimate as an emphasis on both being with what's here and allowing for that, and recognizing that however bad it is right now, that's just part of the process, that there are other things that are also part of the process, like love and connection and, enduring relationship with the person that we've lost. And even a sense of part of the grieving process eventually is that we also get to keep being, even though we've lost this person. And even though at times we may not want to keep being after this loss. It's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
And like you said, if anyone listening can figure out who actually authored it, please let us know so we can give them full credit.
Yeah. So the moral of the story is feel your feelings.
That's the moral of all our stories.
It really is. It's a really good moral. And I think that people don't get it until they hear it 100 times. So we'll just keep saying it.
That's right. It's a solid perpetual moral.
Perpetual moral. Feel all your feelings. Don't deny them. Don't suppress them.
Even when it's complicated.
Don't should on them. Don't let other people should on them. That came up in my family a lot when my siblings would talk negatively about my mother. Family members would correct them and tell them to just remember the good things and to forgive the bad. And I would step in very confidently and be like, no, their feelings are super valid. I was there. That definitely happened. And if you see people shitting on other people's feelings and expression of grief, you can also be an interrupter of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like that you're bringing in a little bit of a social justice angle to it. I think there is that, and we probably haven't put it in that context before, but I really appreciate you bringing in the idea of interrupting someone else shitting all over someone else's grieving process. Yes, let's interrupt that.
Yeah. Let's create the world we want to live in. Well, thank you. Until next time.
Hey, thanks for listening to Full-Time Grievers. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you find out when we release the next episode. If you have thoughts or questions about what we shared, please leave them in the comments below. And if this episode made you think of someone, we invite you to send it to them. They could probably use it. Also, don't forget to get your free Receiving Support While Grieving guide in the show notes below.